On Side Affirmative today, we think it is sad that under the status quo, people are suffering in silence, possibly due to the fact that they have the earliest symptoms of mental illness or later symptoms, and are not seeking help because they feel different. They feel different from others in society. They can't see that others in society are the same as them, and they internalise those feelings of feeling different and don't come forward and suffer in silence. We think pop culture has the capacity to change that by showing characters who have these mental illnesses, by showing them to being able to get treatment, by showing them to be able to be productive members of society, and showing these people as normal, and being able to have normal life experiences, which we think will reduce feelings of isolation for people engaging with this pop culture, and encouraging acceptance and encourage them to come forward and interact more greatly with society. So what do we propose as a model today? We propose that the government provides funding for these productions, for these TV shows and movies, and provides funding proportionate to how realistic these portrayals are, based on realistic experiences of mental illness, and how central these characters are to the plot device. They can't just be in the periphery and get a lot of funding. They have to be central characters, central to that movie or central to that TV show. We think that, well, what do you think will happen? We think that those that didn't previously have the budget to include these types of characters, they had other commercial incentives, will now be able to produce and make these sort of productions with these characters central. And we think that they will now be able to factor in this consideration, whereas previously they had to battle other commercial considerations in weighing up what type of characters to portray. How do we think this will play out in the type of shows we see? We think there'll be more shows which have a character with a mental illness and follow that experience, follow the experience of how they have their day-to-day lives, how they're affected in their job, in their social situations, and possibly how they'll get treatment and how that treatment will help them to be a productive member of society, be an included member of society. We think these portrayals will be on a spectrum from those with most debilitating of mental illnesses to those with the more milder end, to show a realistic spectrum of how mental illness exists in wider society. We think as an outcome, mental illness will be seen as a normal human experience, nothing that you should feel ashamed of, nothing which occurred because of your own fault, something which is normal, and something which isn't a deficiency, and something which is analogous to physical illnesses, which don't have the same level of stigma as a status quo. Three arguments today. Firstly, what is the current stigma and why do we want to reduce it? Secondly, why do we think pop culture is the medium to be able to achieve this, and why we don't think this change will happen without the government funding these sorts of things. So firstly, what is the current stigma? We think under the status quo, many people have mental illness or may have mental illness and are suffering symptoms at early stage or later stage, but not coming forward. What does this result in? We think this results in people dropping out of university, not engaging with school, not engaging with their job, with their family lives, not being able to maintain a job, and possibly in the worst cases, in the later cases, things such as suicide and so forth. We think ultimately it has a debilitating effect on their ability to live their life in spite of that mental illness. Why do we think they don't come forward? We think that mental illness is often seen as a weakness, as a deficiency, as something which is your own fault, as something which is an embarrassment to you, something which you should hide, something which will bring shame to your family, something which will lose your ability to maintain a job. And on other portrayals, you're seen as crazy, unstable, dangerous. You might have not gone to school at a time in which mental illness was taught about, and therefore you don't understand it. And there's no physical or visible characteristic by which other people can detect in you that you have that mental illness. So your ability for other people to engage with you is different from a physical illness for others to detect that. We think as a result, people go into denial, and since they're the only person who can understand that they have their mental illness, they think it's in their head, and they talk themselves out of going to see someone and going to see help. So why do you think the current media doesn't have an incentive to show these types of people existing in pop culture? Because we think the current media and the current producers have an incentive to create characters which are relatable. Characters which are relatable to the majority of people in society, at least a large portion of society, and therefore we think that results in people who have mental illness and different forms of mental illness at different stages and on a different level of the spectrum are not represented, or if they are represented, they're represented at the periphery of that TV show, at the movie, or not central to the plot line. And as a result, people feel stigmatized. They feel like they're on the periphery. They feel like they're not important, and they feel like they don't understand that other people in society have these experiences, and they internalize those feelings of being different and don't feel like they need to come forward. So why do we think pop culture can be effective in changing how people understand mental illness and changing the likelihood that people will come forward and engage with society and engage with available treatment? Because we think, firstly, many people watch pop culture. People do engage with television shows. They do engage with the cinema. They do engage in other forms of pop culture, irrespective of class, race, divide, sexual orientation, and so forth. It's something that is accessible to everyone, and it's something which everyone engages with. We also think pop culture has the capacity to redefine how we understand normal. So while in the 1980s, a lot of portrayals of families were like the Cosby Show with the nuclear family, portrayals of families now show things like Modern Family, where there's two gay guys and a Chinese baby or something, to change and redefine what constitutes normal, so that people can extract and understand there are different ways to understand acceptance, and there are different desirable and acceptable social qualities. So we think pop culture has the capacity to change that, but they don't have the incentive to do that at the moment, as I told you in my first point. So what do we think the effect of this will be? We think people who have these symptoms and recognize that people in these TV shows or in these movies have these symptoms will consider, hey, maybe I do have a problem, maybe I should come forward. Where under the status quo, they might just brush it off, try and have a laugh, think it's all in their head, and not consider going forward, because they don't see going forward as something which is an acceptable form to do. But we see these characters going forward and actually getting help and improving their qualities of life, we think they'll be able to do that. Because we think some of these shows and movies will indeed have a success story, people be able to overcome that type of mental illness and achieve things in their professional and family lives in spite of that mental illness, as opposed to the feelings of feeling ostracized, feeling alone, and feeling like no one else understands what you're going through, which we think occurs on the status quo. We think this is really also important for people who don't have mental illness, because now other people can notice what the symptoms of mental illness are. So as I said in my first point, it's different to physical ailments in which, like, someone's not going to be able to notice if you are having these internal thoughts, or someone's not going to notice if you're having these internal struggles. But now people might be able to have a great capacity to notice the symptoms, so families and so teachers and so employers have a capacity to engage with these types of people. Ultimately, I think on this point is that having something exist to a wide extent in pop culture is effectively equates to broader societal acceptance the more it exists. The more you have characters like Cam and Mitch in Modern Family, the more you have characters who are redefining social norms and what constitutes it being acceptable, changes the perception of people in the way we want to change the perception of the mentally ill, as we want them to be considered normal. We want to see it as an acceptable thing to occur in your life, as opposed to the status quo where it's seen as a weakness and a deficiency. So for my third point, I'm going to tell you why we don't think this will happen otherwise. We think, firstly, these people often aren't represented. As I told you earlier, the characters do have to relate to the majority. Secondly, to the extent to which they are represented, there are other incentives which exist to alter that character and to make them seem in a different way. So when Jack Nicholson is represented in As Good as It Gets, the producer has an incentive to portray a typical type of mental illness, because they want to win something like an Academy Award. At least now they have an incentive of getting greater funding, so they show their mental illness as realistic, as opposed to the portrayals like Angelina Jolie and Girl Interrupted, but portrayals which are more realistic, and we show the spectrum, we show the stage, we show the development of mental illness, and we show it's realistic, because the government funding is proportional to that being realistic. So what do we think is the problem also now? Because under the status quo, a lot of these films which do exist, they're more niche, they don't have the big funding of like Warner Brothers and Time and so forth. So they often only exist in independent cinemas or independent film festivals, and only a small amount of the population engage with them. We want the wider population to engage with them. As I told you earlier, everyone engages with TV and movies. So we think we change the incentives of filmmakers. We're now going to get into the funding, we help the smaller studios and the bigger studios as well. So we're very happy to propose and change how people see these films.
Great, I'd like to thank Mark for his speech and welcome the first speaker for the Negative team, Carol.
Madam Speaker, we think it's unfortunate that the affirmative team thinks that their model is going to make this acceptable and make people come forward for treatment. Society has reached a point where we are comfortable talking about mental illness and admitting that it exists in society, but talking about it in this gung-ho way or pretending that any discussion is better than no discussion is a myth. This kind of condescending message to people suffering from mental illnesses, that these things happen every day, that they're okay and acceptable, is counterproductive to these people seeing this as a problem that can be solved and actually getting out there and seeking help. The the real message that these people should be receiving is not one that just makes us feel better because we're talking about it and we're telling them that we accept them as human beings. The real message that they need is that they don't have to accept these symptoms as normal and that they can and should seek help because these things are completely treatable and manageable. I have a few issues of rebuttal to raise for you today, and then I'm going to talk about 3 issues in substantive. First, that the characterisation of mental illnesses as normal and acceptable is wrong. Secondly, the harmful impact that this will have on the individual, and thirdly, the harmful impact that this will have on society at large. So firstly, to my issues of rebuttal. The affirmative team has characterised their model as one that will encourage people suffering mental illness to seek treatment, but telling people that this is not a problem is not going to make them see it as a problem. In order to continue getting funding for these characters, the characters won't actually end up getting treatment in these series, and they're not going to get better. So the characters that are going to have mental illnesses in these depictions in pop culture are just going to end up these caricatures of people with mental illnesses that are just going to end up sending a message that treatment maybe doesn't work and isn't effective, which is going to be incredibly harmful for people in the long run. So people need to see, the affirmative team has already said that seeing it on TV and pop culture is going to allow them to recognise that they have a problem and come forward and address this problem. So, as I've already said, framing it as this problem is not going to make people see it as a problem. And society has moved past needing to accept mental illness as existing and take away the stigma. We've moved past this, we've done this. We need to move on and focus on treatment and help for these people. And I'm now going to move on to my first issue of substantive, that this characterisation of mental illness as normal and acceptable is just utterly wrong. So, some mental illnesses do have fewer impacts on the life of sufferers and the people that are around them. But even then, we do not classify something as a mental illness unless it impinges on somebody's ability to function in everyday life or in social situations. There's a broad spectrum of these illnesses and the impacts that they're going to have, from the relatively moderate ones like depression, minor compulsions, minor addictions that are going to have smaller impacts on people's lives. But even in these mild situations, people's ability to lead their lives in the way that they would without the illness is going to be impacted. So there's also the very severe ones that I need to mention, like schizophrenia or paranoia or sociopathy. So not only do these impair the life quality of the people who are suffering from them, but they also make these people pose a potential risk to the health and safety of the people around them. It is completely inaccurate to say that the impacts of these wide range of mental illnesses are normal or should be accepted parts of life. We're not saying that these people are stigmatised, and we're not saying that we shouldn't talk about it and have it treated, but saying that it is not a problem and it is something that should be lived with or could be lived with is not an appropriate way to go about it. Cancer is a common thing, but that shouldn't be normal or acceptable either. I'm now going to move on to talk about the actual impact on the individuals who are suffering from this mental illness if we implemented the affirmative team model. So the most common feature of most mental illnesses is a reluctance to seek help or a reluctance to actually tell other people that you're suffering from it. And again, the impacts on actual people range from the severe to the less severe and moderate. So for sufferers of severe mental illness, like paranoid schizophrenics or sociopathic people, they actually may believe that that the people trying to help them are actually out to get them. And if we tell them that this is a normal thing to be going through and these are normal thoughts to be having, then we're reinforcing the idea that they don't need to seek treatment, or that they should be trying to look at a different way to go about their lives or seek help. This also ranges to the less severe. So people who are just suffering sort of mid-range depression, who are uncomfortable admitting that they have a problem or uncomfortable seeking the help that they need. Portraying the things and the difficulties that they're going through in everyday life as normal is harmful when we want to be encouraging them to seek help. Normal harms these people. They need to know that the symptoms that they're experiencing don't necessarily need to be framed as a stigma or something that's their fault. We're not implying in our counter model that they should be blamed for the illnesses that they're experiencing. We're just saying they shouldn't be told that they have to accept it as normal and they should seek help for the things that they're going through. So I'd like to move on to the social harms that extend from these individual harms. So the harms to society that are an impact as well of the impact on individuals suffering these illnesses are all sorts of practical things as well. So people with depression or minor forms of addiction might do simple things like go off their meds. They might find it harder to turn up to work every day. They might not seek treatment as easily. And how are they going to feel better about that and feel better about the treatment that they need to be seeking? If they rock up at work and somebody says, why weren't you here yesterday? Everybody else deals with their depression because it's a normal thing. You should just be dealing with it like it's normal. This can also range to the extreme. So like the paranoid schizophrenics I was talking about before, it normalises the feelings these people have that they don't need treatment for things. And these illnesses that can pose a potential health and safety risk are less likely to be diagnosed, treated or managed. And second to that, the people around them who live with the people with these mental illnesses are less likely to encourage either the people with less severe mental illnesses to go and get help, or the people with more severe mental illnesses, maybe those people around them are less likely to protect themselves or recognise it as a serious problem. So in conclusion, the government has to prioritise the most important message that they can send to these sufferers. In this case, it's not that suffering through these things is normal and that we just want to make ourselves feel better and talk about it in a blasé way, like it's acceptable. It's that these people should seek help, and that if you know anybody suffering, you should help them get help. And the affirmative message sits in opposition to encouraging people to get treatment in this case, when every other message that is trying to be broadcast to the public is drowned out because the government-funded message is saying that your loved one is normal and that your loved one doesn't need help because it's an acceptable way to live your life, then people aren't going to get treatment and people aren't going to be able to deal with this in a normal and healthy way. People need to recognise that their mental illness is something that they don't have to suffer through, and we need to encourage them to get treatment and help, not tell them that it's normal and they should shut up about it. We are proud to oppose.
Okay, I'd like to thank Carolyn for her speech and welcome Pete into the
BLT, stupid fatheads.
How much is this?
No, it's fine. I don't know millions of.
Ladies and gentlemen, the intention of the affirmative team was never to create the impression that having a mental illness was the be-all and end-all of a person. What we wanted was a film industry and a TV industry that had the incentive to create multi-dimensional characters who with mental illnesses, because these directors now had to work with characters that had mental illnesses, but also had to sell those characters to an audience. But moreover, we also gave you very detailed analysis about why the problem with mental illness was that people weren't identifying that they had these symptoms of mental illnesses. We think that our policy creates the situation where people get to experience the first person point of view of someone having mental illnesses, and when they recognize similar thought patterns, they would get help, and that was a benefit that they never dealt with. A few points of rebuttal before I deal with my substantive, which is why the introduction of mentally ill characters in short term, even those who are side characters, increases the chance of that character being significant in the future. But before that, rebuttal. Firstly, broadly speaking, the characterization under the status quo. The first thing we heard was that we as a society had moved past mental illnesses and that we didn't need this policy. The first thing to say is that the problem of underreporting of things like depression was still a huge problem. And it wasn't just a problem which was stagnant, it was a problem which was increasing in nature, where people where the stigma of depression was something which was still bad. But moreover, secondly, we would say that if it was true, and the worst case scenario that people were making strides towards like destroying the stigma around mental illnesses, our side was the one that made it faster and made that social progress faster. But secondly, we would also say that the current status quo of the film industry is one which portrays mentally ill people as binary. You are either someone who's like Rain Man and has high-functioning Asperger's, or you are someone who has suicidal tendencies because you are so depressed. We want to create a realistic middle that most people can recognize and empathize with, and that is something we think which is beneficial because it means that people no longer view themselves as alien, they view themselves as normal, they view themselves of deserving love and deserving help, and there's a benefit that we brought to you. The second thing we heard from the negative team was that people won't seek help. That ignored our analysis about why our policy gave incentives for directors to create characters who wanted to seek help. Why? Because if you're in a film or in a TV series and you are a protagonist that faces a crisis of depression, you want to have a way of resolving that crisis. And the most realistic way of resolving that crisis is oftentimes seeking help. Whether it is going to a sort of psychiatric professional, or whether it is seeking solace with the words of your friends or the other characters. We thought a realistic portrayal was one that seeked help, and under the status quo, people didn't do this. But secondly, we also told you that the symptom analysis, right, that when people saw similar thought patterns, they would seek help earlier, and that was a benefit. But thirdly, the third point of rebuttal is on easy illnesses. The other team wanted to claim that film producers and TV producers would only have characters who had easy illnesses which weren't so severe in fear of alienating audiences. To which we say that isn't a bad thing, because it makes it easier for people to engage with more severe forms of illnesses. Why is this? Because when a film director or a TV producer makes a person have a mental illness which is mild, that breaks the stereotype of a mentally ill person currently, which is someone who is crazy or someone who is deranged. When people see that you can be mentally ill but still be functioning, that makes it easier for you to engage with other people with mental illnesses, because now you see there's a possibility that they aren't so different from you. And as a result, you're more likely to ask your friend if you are okay, because the fear of mental illness is not as bad, and that's also a good thing. I have one point of substantive in this speech. Why the introduction of mentally ill characters in the short term increases the chance of that character being significant. And this deals with the worst case scenario, where even in the worst case scenario where a film producer tries to get a subsidy by only having a marginal or even tokenistic character, why we still get significant benefits. Why is this? Because our policy incentivizes the creation of minor characters with mental illness, but it's still beneficial because these characters become significant in the future. Why is this? Because these characters are usually experimental, right? These characters are usually quite different from the other characters on the plot. And the producers usually don't know how audiences will react to these people. So the case study that we will use is Jerry Aspenson in Boston Legal. When he was first introduced, he was only introduced as a plot device whose defining feature was his mental illness, right? He was supposedly crazy. But what happened was that people ended up liking him. They ended up empathizing with him, and they also found him a fascinating character because he was so different from the other characters who were regular people. As a result, the producers brought him as a recurring character. What happened was they now showed his path of entering treatment and becoming a more useful person within the show. And it increased his ability to function. And that culminated in him becoming a partner in the law firm. Why is this beneficial? Because we think that the way that these characters will play out on the screen usually mirrors the way that interactions with mentally ill people in a real world go, right? You usually, when you interact with a mentally ill person and that person tells you that he or she is mentally ill, you focus on that person and identify that person's mental illness as the defining feature of that person. But over time, you realize that that person has hopes and dreams and can function normally the same way you do. And you discover the nuances in his character or her character that you know and love. And eventually, you discover the person within, and that breaks down the walls and stigma that surrounds mental illnesses. Under the status quo, there are too few Jerry Aspensons within TV. People who are mentally ill are either extremely crazy or extremely high functioning, as I said earlier. It's time we broke this binary down and we created a realistic middle, right? Where someone can not just have a mental illness, but struggle significantly in dealing with it, but eventually overcome that mental illness. And that's something that's good. That's something that film producers will want to show because it shows the triumph of the protagonist against a significant crisis of character. And we think film producers will have a huge incentive to do this. What have we shown you in this debate? We've shown you that the problem in the status quo is one of empathy. Not just of empathy with other people, but empathy with yourself. When you never realize that people out there had the same illness as you, you felt like people currently feel like they are alone, because mental illness is one which is invisible. When someone loses an arm, you can see that. And you can see that many people sometimes also don't have arms, and you don't feel as alone. But when you have a mental illness, the pattern of doom that runs within your head that says that you are not worthy of love, that you are different and you will never be normal, is one which can never be fixed by the processes that happen in the status quo. Ours is a world which makes that different. It makes it seem, it makes it true that mental illness is something that is normal, is something that can be dealt with, and is something that people can function despite it, we propose.
Okay, I'd like to thank you for the speech and welcome the second speaker in the training panel.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is not impossible for a TV show to portray a character with mental illness in a way that is respectful to the difficulties that that character or that individual, were they real, would be likely to face in the real world. What is unlikely is that a studio that was motivated primarily by the money available from the government would do that well. The problem is, for example, what does a sitcom that portrays someone struggling with mental illness on a day-to-day basis look like when that is trying to be a comedy show? What does a show look like when they have a character who is too terrified of the world around them to get out of bed? How does an audience respond to that character? How do you maintain your funding for your mentally ill character if you show them successfully getting treatment and moving past that mental illness or moving past the need to deal with it on a day-to-day basis? The portrayals that they actually incentivize by trying to get everyone and their dog to portray these characters are actually really problematic. They are most likely to get caricatures. They are most likely to get individuals or TV studios or musicians that are not aware enough of the complexities of those issues to portray them in ways that are respectful or in ways that are useful pieces of social messaging, which is why we don't try and encourage people to do these types of things with money, because they inevitably do them badly because they would not have organically sought out to do those things themselves in the first place. I'm going to talk with my substantive material in more detail about the unique problems of that format, but I want to deal with 2 points of rebuttal first. Firstly, what does their portrayal look like when these TV studios or music groups or whatever it is take up that challenge, and how do those with mental illness respond to those portrayals? Let's start with what those portrayals look like. Keith says they not only have to portray someone with that mental illness, they also have to sell them to an audience. That's actually the problem in this debate. It's really difficult to sell a sympathetic character dealing with the genuine effects of serious, deep, manic depression. Those types of individuals are usually not highly charismatic, they're usually not deeply entertaining, they usually don't interact with many other characters because they frequently feel threatened by those forms of social interactions. So attempting to insert a character that was realistically dealing with that type of mental illness would require you inserting a character that did not interact with your other characters, that did not make jokes, that was not amusing to an audience that was looking for casual, light entertainment. There are definitely some forms of media that do this really well. Things like Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind show individuals that are dealing with quite serious mental illnesses in ways that are generally fairly respectful, to the extent to which that is important and necessary for those characters. But trying to get those in every single context in the media is really problematic. And we've actually got a really good example of that when you look at something like Homeland. They inserted a character with quite serious mental illness and then slowly degraded her over season after season towards an absolute caricature of that illness. That's really problematic. Why did they do that? Because she had to remain entertaining. She had to remain appealing to an audience that didn't understand the consequences of living with that type of illness. Incentivizing more people to do this badly is not a good solution to the fact that many in society do not understand the challenges that someone going through that illness looks like. But let's look at the conclusions that they're trying to get people to draw from seeing those characters. The way Keith portrays it, they want people to see those characters, recognize those symptoms in themselves or in their loved ones, and therefore seek treatment. But that ignores the quite nuanced way in which those portrayals send messages. Seeing someone who has mental illness doesn't automatically make you feel comfortable seeking treatment.
if the way that mental illness is portrayed is as something that lasts over season after season regardless of treatment, why would you think that treatment was likely to work? And guess what? You've just financially incentivized that exact portrayal of mental illness. If you see someone who is interacting normally in their day-to-day life with their work or with other characters or maintaining social friendships because the producers need that in order to actually show that character in any scenes, how do you feel when you then can't do that yourself but you feel that same depression? How accurate do you feel that is about you? How likely do you feel that you're going to be able to seek treatment or respond? How alienated do you feel by a society that sees that as the most normal perception of what mental illness looks like? Which brings me to my second point of rebuttal. How do those with mental illness respond to this? There's very little response from Keith to the impacts on the individuals that Caroline brought you, but let's look at them. It's about individuals who feel bad for not being able to maintain a job or not being able to maintain friendships when they see characters with their mental illness on a TV show doing those things because that was required for that character to interact with anyone. Or they feel like those key characters do this for years with no prospect of treatment because they see season after season of someone dealing with bipolarity with no ability to seek treatment that works because then that character would no longer be mentally ill and that funding would no longer be available. Or worse, they see those characters relegated to being sideshows because the producer couldn't find a way to organically and naturally have that character interact with other characters in that show without that ignoring the mental illness that would present challenges for them doing that. So they're reduced to the bipolar sister or the drug-addicted brother that so many TV characters appear to have that appears for random episodes to show off their mental illness and then disappears again because that character could not be portrayed interacting in a way that was actually representative of what their mental illness would do if they were required to be in every single episode of that show. Which moves me to my substantive material, which deals more directly with this. Let's assume for a moment that their messages about mental illness were good ones to send and didn't have all of the consequences that Caroline told you about. The filter of things like a music video or a TV show or a movie is not a good filter to communicate the complexity of what is a deeply unique and individualized illness to those who do not understand it to begin with. Someone who wants to go and see a 1.5-hour movie, to take the most extreme example of where these characters might be portrayed the most likely to be sympathetically or usefully, is often looking for light entertainment. And to the extent to which they're not, movies about characters with mental illness already are produced. But you now incentivize everyone to throw in one of those characters. And the individuals who then go to that cinema looking for a casual rom-com about someone falling in love and see the brother with mental illness continuously in scenes don't feel entertained by that presence, don't feel it welcome in what they're looking for when they went to see that movie or they went to see that action film and didn't particularly feel like watching a superhero struggle to get out of bed before saving the world. And it's really problematic that their attitude towards those characters is then one of resentment. But let's take the more likely example, which is not in fact that these get thrown into movies, where often those are exceptionally tightly written, but is that they get thrown into very short and fairly commercially easy to produce things like music videos, where individuals throw them into like 3 or 4 minute clips that actually don't have the time to portray those individuals in a way that is nuanced or complex, but also carry a variety of distracting features like music and dances and flashing lights that distract those individuals from the depth of that message when they watch it casually and are not looking for the deep message within that, which is why things like Lily Allen's music video trying to address the issues of sexism in the music industry gets distilled down to that looks kind of racist instead of what a great way to challenge stereotypes about black women in music videos, because people don't listen to the lyrics, they don't listen to the complexity of that message, and therefore are most likely to reduce what they see to a caricature, even if the individual trying to portray them is doing the best that they can. So where do we conclude in this? The worst possible portrayal of mental illness is as a novelty, is as entertainment, or is as something that you can just push through and continue to function normally like everyone else. That is exactly the message about mental illness that you promote when you ask people, or indeed fund people, who are trying to produce things that are commercially viable to a wide audience to try and portray characters that deal with these deep and systematic problems that are not as simple as a joke or a punchline in these movies. We think it's deeply problematic to encourage those who would not organically take on that challenge to do it because they are most likely to be the ones who do that the worst. That is a really bad message for everyone attempting to deal with mental illness in society and those who we need to have on board to combat it. We're therefore proud to oppose.
I'd like to thank Madeline for her speech. speech and welcome the final speaker for the affirmative team.
To be clear, studios already produce characters who have difficulty fitting into the real world, who come out as being somewhat pariahs and have to struggle to form relationships with other people. It's just that instead of because of having a mental illness, it's because they're played by Vince Vaughn. The suggestion that our model was going to create a bunch of really trash and poorly integrated and poorly created characters ignored the model we set up from the beginning, whereby the amount of funding was linked to how accurately you portray a mental illness and how comprehensively you integrate that character into the plot of the show. Sure, there might be a couple of really fringe cases where the receptionist just has a small mental disability, but we thought that in order to create really meaningful characters that exercise the maximum amount of funding from our model, shows were going to have to make them a major element of the plot, and for precisely the reasons Madeline identified, in order to sell them to the audience, they had to make them interesting, they had to make them relatable, and they had to make them an actual valid part of the plot. That's why we thought we were going to get a more useful depiction of mentally disabled people in film than we got by the crazy depressives trying to kill themselves under the status quo. 3 questions in summary. What kind of characters does our model produce? Is it an effective educator about mental illness? And will it deter people from getting treatment? On the first point, what we heard from Madeline in a rhetorical question was, what kind of mentally disabled character do you try to create when you're putting them in a comedy show? I'll tell you, Sheldon Cooper, Amy Farrah Fowler, characters who are initially there because that mental disability is like their driving point. It is the selling point of that character, and it's the thing that makes them most unique. But you can't run season after season of a show without somehow making that mental disability useful for the plot device. And that's why they're not just caricatures. That's why they're not, for the long term, just caricatures that never deal with that illness or never progress beyond it. Because over the long term of a show, to keep that character interesting, to keep the audience caring about them, you have to encourage them to form relationships and to evolve beyond that. And we've seen that explicitly from characters like Amy Farrah Fowler, who have gone from being a caricature to trying to overcome that illness and trying to form more meaningful relationships with other characters. We brought you the example of Jerry Espenson, who was literally initially brought in as a 2-episode caricature, just as Madeline wanted to assert. But because he appealed to the audience, because they found him fun, the producers found ways to write him back into the show and decided that the best way the audience would be able to empathise and identify with him was by seeing him get treatment and try to become a more normal character. That's something I'm going to expand on later. But we'd also tell you that there just aren't really that many incentives to create degenerative and bad types of characters. Because to the extent that you tried to create a character who never saw treatment, it would be really difficult to keep them as being entertaining or as entertaining to an audience. And we told you that the most likely way they would try to characterize those people was using their pursuit of treatment as being a means of giving them a plot point in a story and of making them interesting. But let's take the worst case scenario. We think it's more realistic to say that maybe some producers will do each approach, that you'll get some people who don't seek treatment and become degenerative and become cripplingly unhappy, and that you'll see some who do pursue treatment and it proves to be somewhat effective. We think that creating that spectrum and that juxtaposition of different characters with mental disabilities approaching it differently is itself a useful thing to include in the film industry, because it creates a difference of approach to whether or not you seek treatment as being effective. We just don't believe that it was necessarily that the majority of cases that were going to be created were going to be caricatures, but even if some were, we thought it was likely we were going to get a nuanced spectrum of different approaches to dealing with mental disability, and we thought that was going to be positive. So secondly, is this an effective means of educating the public? What we heard was that we will only see like the mildest and most palatable types of mental disability and not the extreme hardcore ones. Well, to the extent that we're not seeing portrayal of really hardcore mental disabilities right now, that isn't a harm imposed by our model. But we told you that if you start with a greater incentive to bring in these smaller, more nuanced and more palatable examples, it makes it easier in the long term to bridge the gap to the massive manic depressives, to the massive crazy people who are really hard to empathise with. We think the more you normalise mild forms of mental illness, the more you incentivise people to believe in mental illness as something that is not concretely definable and that is overcomable. We think that because of that, there will be a greater willingness on the audience to empathise with people beyond that. But we also told you that there were really short-term and necessary reasons to identify depression and to coerce people into getting treatment for it right now, because people kill themselves when they feel that like they are a pariah that is utterly irreconcilable irreconcilable with the majority of society. And they have still provided us no really nuanced analysis as to why any real response as to why and what makes it easier for your friends and for you to identify that illness based on symptoms that they didn't know. Keith spent a lot of time explaining why, because the symptoms of this illness are invisible, because you yourself often struggle to identify them, having any depiction of a character who is relatable, experiencing those same symptoms, makes it easier for you or a friend to address them. The response we got from Madeline was, well, just because you know about them doesn't suddenly make you comfortable in discussing them. Well, Mr. Speaker, the first thing to say is that knowing about them and not being entirely comfortable with them is still an improvement, because it might incentivise you to go to a counsellor and find out what the best approach to talking to that person is, or to talk to someone important to them who you think might be better able to discuss it. But we also think that it's just still more likely for people to be comfortable in our world than it is in their world, because the greater extent to which people are exposed to mental illness in the media, the less stigmatised it will be and the more willing they will be to engage with people who they think might potentially have it. It'll also just make it far less offensive if you suggest to someone that you think they might be having a minor case of depression, and you can point to comparable symptoms from a character you recognise. We think that this is likely to break down barriers to recognising and deal with mental disability, and that's where even the best case scenario for that side helps our model, because even seeing really fringe characters experiencing some amount of mental disability in a show is still going to improve your awareness over what exists now. So final question, will this deter them from getting treatment? And what they said was they didn't want it to be seen as normal and acceptable for someone to have a disability. And we didn't want to create the delusion that someone with a mental disability was identical to someone without, Mr. Speaker. Rather, what we wanted to create was the more realistic world conception that just because they had a mental disability, it didn't preclude them having other attributes. It didn't preclude them from being intelligent and from having goals and from being an all-rounded three-dimensional character. What we'd say is that that just doesn't happen enough under that side, because the portrayal of the characters in the media that exists right now is that having depression automatically makes you want to kill yourself and you're never able to deal with it, or that you're a really high-functioning person with autism and that you require no assistance or no empathy from other people in order to engage with that. But their main reason for believing that people wouldn't seek treatment is because the filmmakers would create stories in which the person didn't seek treatment, or they sought treatment and it didn't work. To deal with that latter one, Mr. Speaker, we told you these depictions had to be realistic in order to get funding. So if the treatment wasn't working, the studio had to create a real reason why the treatment wouldn't work, and that meant people who watched that show could find out about that obstacle and could help remove it when trying to find treatment for other people. So again, they missed the nuance of our model, whereby we were using intelligent approaches to the depiction of treatment in order to make it more palatable. But we also just think that the suggestion that they won't use effective treatment is a farce in and of itself. Because treatment for a mental disability doesn't happen in one episode. If a producer tries to pursue it, they can still stretch that plot over a long period of seasons, and they can use it as an interesting story point to continue the show. We thought it was a farce to say people would never be seen getting treatment, or that it would be the norm to see them kill themselves in the long term instead. Mr. Speaker, they had no way of dealing with this other than to continue the stigma by keeping these people out of film. We were proud to try and find an effective and nuanced means to try and convince these people they needed to seek treatment, to try and convince them that they were still salvageable as people.
Okay, I'd like to thank Tom for his speech and welcome Sanji, please. Thank you.
The problem with the negative team in this debate is they have willfully misunderstood the nature of mental illness. Mental illness is not something that needs to be sold to the general public. Mental illness is not something that needs to be glamorized. It is not something that needs to be bundled up in nice, convenient 20-minute segments and then thrown out for the mass market to eat up. That misunderstands A, the importance of mental illness, and B, the ways that you actually get help for people who have mental illness, right? Because Tom said that no one will portray the secretary with mild depression, right? Because that's not an interesting character. They're going to go for the Sheldon Coopers. Correct. The number of Sheldon Coopers in this world are minimal at best. The number of people who have mild depression are significantly more than that. When you want to target people, and that's what Moran said in his very introduction, was that a lot of people are underreporting depression. A lot of people don't have these illnesses, or sorry, rather, they don't want to admit that they have these illnesses. Talking about Sheldon Cooper doesn't solve that in any way, shape or form. So I've got two questions at the end of this debate. Firstly, how will people with mental illness actually respond to this? And secondly, is television a good / even mildly appropriate medium to try and send messages of this content? So firstly, how do people with mental illness respond? Because Tom said that, well, they all said actually, that you have to sell mental illness. So what happens when your mentally ill person doesn't do well when it comes to ratings? What happens when people say, actually, we don't like this character for a variety of reasons? They get scrapped, right? Well, that TV show fails. Or all of the things that happen when mass media says no for whatever reason that they do. That means that you have written out a segment of people that you want to target firstly. But more importantly, right, they said, this is really fundamentally important in the progress in the march of mental illness, because now people can self-diagnose. I'm sorry, number one, the number of people who watch television to try and self-diagnose mental illness is infinitesimally small at best. But more importantly, right, people with mental illness try to not have that, right? It is not a thing where they're looking at television saying, I wonder if I have depression. Oh, this could be fun. Let me see if I can count the number of symptoms. They don't say, oh no, I only have 3 of those 4 symptoms. I don't have mental illness. No, they're suffering far worse things than I have. Well, they try to explain away their mental illness in a way that doesn't impact on them, right? Because they say that people want to have mental illness, or they want to work out they have mental illness from watching Friends or whatever. The answer is no. Actually, people don't do that, and more importantly, they probably shouldn't do that, right? Because if they say, well, I have slightly less problematic depression than character A, I can deal with this at home. It's normal and it's acceptable, and this person can work through their crap by talking with their friends they wanted to talk about. Great. That's what I'll do too. I'll just talk about this with my friends. I won't try and get help. I won't try and deal with this or manage this in any other way. I don't have the problem. Thirdly, they said that there is a binary portrayal of mental illness, right? Either you have Asperger's or you have a couple of days where you're a little bit blue. That doesn't change, right? Your problem with the binary aspect of mental illness doesn't change, because people are now just chasing either the really glamorous, entertaining Sheldon Coopers, or the mild secretary with depression, or the mild side brother that crops up and has a couple of problems and then goes away for the rest of the season. You don't change the problem that you set out in this debate. You don't change underreporting of depression. You don't change the number of people who are self-diagnosed, and you don't do anything. So why is TV a bad medium to do this? Because what do these portrayals actually look like? We told you all down the bench these portrayals are incredibly harmful, right? Because they are creating characters that appeal to the mass market. That means that either A, they are long-term sufferers that are there season after season who don't get help. And we never heard any response from the negative about what happens when characters don't get help. Because that's the part of the television shows. You have a character there with mental illness and they're struggling. And that goes on season after season. What happens? People see someone who isn't getting better, right? That doesn't help people with mental illness, because it's well, no one's getting better. Why would I even bother trying to get treatment? Screw this, I'm screwed for life. That doesn't help them. But the other thing is, they get fixed right away. So what happens when people with mental illness go and get treatment and it doesn't work the first time? Because the reality is that that's quite a frequent occurrence. People get treatment and they fall off the wagon and they go back and try and do it again. When they say, no, this person got treatment on TV, and apparently people are so swayed by character portrayals that this person got treatment and now they're fine, they're getting married in 5 episodes, isn't it great for them? I'm not that person, I just need to give up because I'm a really shit human being. It plays into all the harmful things that people think about themselves when they have depression, that they're not worthwhile, that they don't have any ability to get through the world, that they're not useful and or a good person, and that it's their fault that they have this thing. All of that is made more harmful when they see characters who are more successful than they are on television. Finally, he said that, but Sheldon in Big Bang Theory is a really great example of someone where mental illness is now a thing. One, Asperger's isn't actually a mental illness which you can recover from, so the point at which those things are analogous is mildly off topic. But secondly, he's actually a punchline. He and Amy Farrah Fowler are legitimately the punchline of the show. Source, people using his one-line responses as t-shirts, right? So, the fact that he's been reduced to a punchline is actually really harmful, because it says, oh, well, if you've got Asperger's, just try and be mildly entertaining for your friends, and everything will go well for you. Hopefully you're really good at science. Right. In this debate, the affirmative team told us that there will be less stigma. They didn't ever tell us why there would be less stigma, just that somehow more characters on screen in bad portrayals, as Madeline analysed, will somehow lead to less stigma. That people will either be very persuasively swayed in watching their half an hour episode of Friends that mental illness is a real problem and I should really ask all my friends that I've got if they need my support and or help. We think that's improbable at best. The other response is that people who have mental illness will suddenly think, oh, it's really normal and okay to have this. This is normal, this is okay. And we told you why this wasn't the appropriate message to send. We told you that common is not the same as normal, right? Lots of people suffer from physical illnesses all the time, and they are common for people to have cancer. It doesn't mean that it is normal to have cancer and or that you should be trying to not seek treatment for that, or that you should be trying to just live with it and accept it and roll on. And or that society around you should just not care, because it is normal that a lot of people have mental illness. So why are you the one who's making a fuss about it? Why are you drawing attention to it? Why are you asking for help all the time? Shut up and sit down. We said that's incredibly harmful. We said that stigma in no way is actually solved by having a couple of mildly interesting characters or some really boring characters on television show. Second, they said that people will be able to recognise their own depression. Which fundamentally misunderstands the way that mental illness works. Because people don't watch TV and be like, oh, I want that thing, that's me. They try to not be that person, right? And they try to disassociate themselves with characters that have mental illness. That's problematic. Next, they said that TV is actually the best medium, because a lot of people watch TV. Yes, a lot of people watch TV, but a lot of people don't watch TV to work out or understand the way that mental illness works, right? We think there are far more effective and actually far more useful ways of targeting this through other forms of media that aren't like sitcoms or some TV shows. Finally, we told you right from the start that there is a much more important message to be sending, right? That is, that now that society is much more comfortable with talking about mental illness, see, as Carolyn told us, the recent number of significantly famous and or well-known people coming out and saying, I'm a long-term sufferer of this, that, or the other, the number of people who are more happy talking about this in public, the number of people who are more happy getting help. We told you that that is a trend in society and that we should look to the next trend, and that is people getting actual help. And the government should target its message not to making everyone feel happy about that they're talking about this in some way. This isn't a pat on the back, yay, aren't we really good people for understanding that people have mental illness. No, this is that the government has a role in looking to the next hurdle, which is getting people to have actual treatment. The next hurdle, which is getting some kind of outcome for people and saying, you don't have to live with this. Sure, you might suffer from this and you think that your neighbours and friends are okay with you suffering. Try and do something about it. See if you want to get mental help. See if you want to ask your family and friends to help you. More importantly, we told you that this message just fundamentally doesn't work. That it's actually harmful and it screws over a whole bunch of people who've been screwed over for a long time. Let's not continue that cycle. Thanks.
Great, I'd like to thank Sam for his teaching, creative for his team.